Thank you so much for tuning in to the 11th episode of the Better Dad Show. I'm Bill. I'm not saying I'm the better dad, but I am someone who's wanting to become a better dad. So hopefully that's why you're joining us today. That's why you're tuning in, and you're following along with us as we continue on our journey to become better dads, better husbands, and better men. So last week we read about respect and how we need to be showing respect for our wives, as well as for teaching our kids how to show respect to us and to others around us. So the questions from last week were: in what ways do you give your son the respect he deserves as a man in training? Also, what are some ways you can teach your son to respect women? And does the behavior you model encourage or discourage your son from respecting other authority figures in his life? That's a challenging one, I think, for all of us, because I know that for myself, there's always ways that I can grow. There's ways I'm sure that you feel you can grow as well. And I want us to challenge each other that we can do that, and that we look at ways that we can grow and become better. If you're watching this now, you'll probably see I'm looking around quite a bit. I've got streaming issues, so let me know in the chat if this is giving you issues. I'm going to just continue reading because I'm also recording this locally, and we'll be uploading a recorded version if the stream version isn't quite up to scratch. So if you head over to betterdadshow.com, you can subscribe. You can find us on all the socials. Right now we're live on DLive, Twitch, Instagram, and YouTube. We're not live on Facebook yet, and actually on Instagram we're live on my personal channel because the Better Dad Show channel does not yet have enough followers to enable streaming. So if you can follow me on Instagram, Better Dad Show, and follow me on Facebook, we can then get those live streaming functions on those pages. So again, thank you for joining us. We are going to be continuing to read the book Better Dads, Stronger Sons by Rick Johnson. We are right now on to chapter 10, and chapter 10 is about sex. So this could be a spicy one, but we are going to continue to read that. I'm going to just share this on my personal Facebook page, and once we have done that, we will continue with this chapter. So where are we? All right, YouTube is the most active place for the chat. So if you do want to head over there, you can join us. All right, here we go. We are now on to chapter 10, all about sex. With her flattering lips, she seduces him. Immediately he went after her, as an ox goes to the slaughter. Proverbs 7:21-22, New King James Version. This passage from Proverbs rings truer than most of us would like to admit. I would like to think I'm beyond such nonsense, but the truth is, it probably wouldn't take much more than an attractive woman flattering me, and before long, without some form of accountability in place, I'd blindly be following along behind her into sexual sin. Therefore, it's a good thing that A, God made women more relationship-oriented than men, B, God does not put us in situations beyond what we can endure, and C, the majority of women do not find me irresistible. There we go. It's a benefit for some of us, isn't it? Now, before some of you out there start sputtering about how lacking in self-control or spiritual immaturity I must be for admitting that, let's be honest with ourselves, shall we? Most of you men reading this know in your hearts that you're no better than I am in this regard. We can easily say we wouldn't fall into temptation when we've never had to experience its full frontal assault. Not many of us are beyond succumbing to temptation in this area. Our male egos rationalize this kind of behavior. I cannot tell you how many godly men who seem bulletproof from sexual temptation, I've observed over the years who have been forced to resign their positions as pastors, elders, or other leaders in the church because of some sexual impropriety. And that's just here in my little corner of the world. Whenever I see that happening, I always think, but for the grace of God, there goes any one of us. That's one of the reasons why I've always been taught that we need to flee temptation. Don't let yourself be challenged by it. Don't let yourself experience it, but just run. Leave it. Stay away. God created us men as physical, visually orientated, sexual beings. He created our spirituality with our wives to be a wonderful, exciting experience to be treasured. Unfortunately, our sexual urges have been twisted due to our sin nature into something beyond what God intended. Lust is a constant struggle, and those males who choose to live a life of sexual purity might face a mighty battle. But through God's grace, we can overcome the struggle and guilt, finding joy in our sexuality. As with most things in life, men and women tend to view sex from different perspectives. God created both genders of sexual beings, yet different. You and I both know that if women knew what men really think about most of the time, they quite possibly would refuse to be in the same room with us. They think we're perverted. And if you remember your adolescence, you realize that your son is probably no different than you. We tend to think our kids are different than we were at their age. But if anything, kids nowadays are probably much more worldly and sophisticated than we were. If sex is not the first thing on a man's mind, it's certainly always lurking around in the background, waiting to spring forward and pounce. Let's look at some of the minefields you and your son face every day. Now, as we read this, we need to remember that this book was actually written back in 2006. So, our kids nowadays must be facing such bigger challenges than we are, or than we did growing up. I mean, right now, they've got access to everything right here. And it's disgusting. I can't even go on Instagram or Twitter without being bombarded with sexualized images. And for our kids to be exposed to that at such a young age, I mean, it can really mess them up. Minefields. One of the challenges we face is everyday life and the circumstances we find ourselves in. One of the best strategies, just back to the mobile phones. If you give your kids a mobile phone, let them watch it in their room, you give them unfettered internet access. I saw a meme that says you're stealing their childhood. As soon as you hand over a phone, you're taking that away from them. So just think about that. Like, what are you letting your kids expose themselves to by giving them a phone or giving them a tablet? Minefields. One of the challenges we face in everyday life and the circumstances we find ourselves in. One of the best strategies we can use to keep our sexual perspective intact is to not allow ourselves to be caught in situations where we might be compelled to compromise our integrity, fleeing from temptation, right? While keeping yourselves out of situations where you be tempted is best. Sometimes that's not always practical or even possible. Obviously, we should stay away from topless bars, internet pornography sites, and girly magazines. When we are out of town on business trips, we should stay out of bars, not have dinner alone with female coworkers, and definitely not watch adult movies in our rooms. But what about the everyday circumstances of life? Suppose your office has an attractive secretary. Does that mean you should quit your job so you're not tempted by your desires? What if your child's teacher is a real stunner? Does that mean you should never talk to her about your child's progress for fear of having lust enter your heart? What about attractive women at church? Do you run from them to keep from having uncomfortable feelings? No. You'll learn to control your feelings and emotions to prevent acting on your own desires. It's part of having a responsible, masculine sexuality. I try to work out at the gym faithfully 3 times a week. I participate in a grueling hour-long co-ed weightlifting class. Many of the women in the class are young and attractive. Most are in very good physical condition. The powerful struggle to control my eyes and imagination when attractive women wearing tight, skimpy exercise clothing are exercising around me is often greater than the physical workout itself. Thankfully, the workout is so painful that I seldom have the inclination or energy left for daydreaming. Should I not go to the gym because attractive women in skimpy clothing frequent there? I'm presenting the above scenario a bit tongue-in-cheek, but my point is that all good men have learned to control their natural desires in everyday circumstances. Our sons need to learn at an early age that they too will have to responsibly master this burden as well. When I think of my own struggle with sexual lust, I often think of Samson, whose story is told in chapters 13 through 16 of the book of Judges. Samson was set apart and equipped by God, like most men. Samson was specially equipped to be a mighty vessel for God. Some men probably wonder if they could even defend themselves in a fight if push came to shove, but Samson didn't have that problem. God's power... I lost my place. But Samson didn't have that problem. God's power was manifested in Samson as superhuman strength. As you probably remember, in a fit of rage, with revenge on his mind, he picked up the jawbone of a donkey and killed 1,000 men. See Judges 15, and talk about an action hero. You know the rest of the story. As you fast forward through Samson's escapades, you see pride, arrogance, self-centeredness, sexual immorality, disobedience, and revenge. In the end, he paid with his life. But the main thing that comes to mind when I think of Samson is sexual immorality. When I read the story of Samson, I find myself thinking, are you really that stupid? Wake up. First, he goes to the Philistines looking for a wife when his parents advised against it. Then he sleeps with a prostitute. Finally, he goes to Delilah time and again, totally self-focused and self-reliant rather than God-reliant. But then I look at myself. How often do I do my own thing, beg for forgiveness, and then, seeing that I have survived, go right back to the very thing that would take my life? Sexual sin taints everything around it. Your sexual sin impacts your family in ways you may never know. The most obvious way is the example you set. Is your sexuality honoring and showing respect to your wife? Have you taught your son that women are not just to be used to satisfy our urges and then tossed aside? Have you taught him that women are to be protected, honored, and cherished? Remember, the example you set, especially in this area of life, is what your son will think is normal. Accountability. Accountability makes all the difference in the world when it comes to a man being sexually responsible. For instance, I'm careful to make sure that I have other people to whom I am accountable at every seminar I present for single moms raising boys. It's not because I am so desirable personally, but because I represent what many of these women yearn for in life. Hence, I need to take the proper precaution to ensure that I have accountability at all times, so I'm not tempted to take advantage of someone's vulnerability. Men are naturally equipped to know instinctively when a woman is either vulnerable or available. Even when it's not obvious, we often can sense an opportunity. This explains why some women just seem to have men flock around them, even when they are not overly sensuous or even necessarily very attractive. When a man walks without accountability in his life, he tends to make up the rules as he goes. He has a tendency to justify or rationalize whatever desire his mind comes up with. I remember a frightening episode that happened a while back. Suzanne and the kids were out of town for the weekend. I was driving around alone in an unfamiliar part of town, running errands on Saturday night when I approached a strip club. Portland is known as the city with the highest number of nude bars per capita of any city in the United States. Unbidden thoughts suddenly popped into my head. You could go in there. No one knows you around here. No one would recognize your car here. Suzanne's out of town. She would never find out. No one from church would see you. I tried vainly to capture my thoughts. Going into the club was something I did not want to do under any circumstances. I had a wife, a family, a reputation, a business, a ministry, and my soul to lose. Even so, my mind continued to poke and prod to try to find ways to justify my carnal desires. You could go in there as an experiment, just to see if your faith is strong enough to overcome your lust. Next came the clincher. It could be like a mission. You could go in and try to testify those poor girls in there. You could reach out to them in faith. Yeah, right. The only reaching out I'd be doing in there wouldn't be with faith, but with dollar bills, and I knew it. My fight to control my lustful desires became a struggle of epic proportions, all because my semblance of accountability was temporarily out of my life. Finally, I resorted to prayer, asking God to remove me from the temptation. Thankfully, the stoplight was green at the corner the club was located on, and I didn't have to stop, or I might have lost that battle. In retrospect, the story is rather funny now, how my mind or flesh tried to use cunning and guile to persuade me against my will. Yet, at the time, there was nothing funny about it. I was scared, stupid, by the potential destruction I was capable of committing to my life. So I take that one step further and to say it might not have even been his mind that was initiating it, but it could have been the devil prompting it. I mean, I think that's something very real and something that he would definitely have a desire to see families ripped apart, to see, dads removed from their children and dads removed from their husbands removed from their wives. I mean, I know that is something that the devil is into. So, next step. sex education. Talking to your kids about sex is difficult. That's why many parents today leave the sexual education of their kids to the schools. But because it's tough is precisely why you as a father have a duty to teach your kids about sexual purity. Dads are supposed to handle the tough and unpleasant tasks in life. Sure, it's not easy talking about sex, but even the Bible is pretty straightforward when discussing sexual issues. Ever read Ezekiel chapter 23? I know the chapter is merely a metaphor for Jerusalem, but talking to our children about sex is probably just about as shocking as reading those lewd sexual descriptions in the Bible. I wasn't particularly comfortable talking about sex with my son, much less my daughter. But if you start early and can become comfortable discussing these issues before puberty sets in, you're probably the best person to introduce your son to a subject that can either be a friend or foe throughout his lifetime. He will go through puberty and will have many questions. Wouldn't you rather your son get the answers to those questions from you rather than from his buddies down the street? Or worse yet, from the secular entertainment industry? In order to be able to discuss openly with your son God's vision for masculine sexuality, you'll have to develop a strong relationship. This will require your reaching out and making the effort to foster a closer relationship. Your son probably won't come to you and initiate discussions about sex. An article adapted from the book Preparing Your Son for Every Man's Battle by Stephen Artburn, Fred Stoker, and Mike Yorkie addresses the subject of talking about sex with your son. Here's some of what the article had to say. There's an old saying that goes, rules without relationship equal rebellion. Dads may be good at laying down a laundry list of rules, but we're pretty poor when it comes to building a foundation for two-way communication. That's too bad, because many of us start out with a winning relationship with our sons in the early years. As he grows, however, we keep on emphasizing rules when we should be emphasizing the relationship more. He's got questions to ask, Dad. Are you going to be the one to hear them, or will his friends get the call? Your young running back is looking for the ball. He's starting to strike out on his own. Are you, God's first team quarterback, up to the task? To do it, you'll need a relationship, and you'll have to work to get something going. Things don't fall into place naturally. Blam, puberty hits, and he's got questions, and you've got answers, but he's not asking yet. He doesn't feel confident enough to ask you why he can't keep his eyes off Lisa's well-developed breasts in science class, which he can't help but notice when she wears those fluorescent-colored low-cut tube tops she likes. And what's with the wet dream stuff and the masturbation thing everyone's talking about? Sounds like what you and I went through when we were that age, doesn't it? I wish I had a father I could have gone to for guidance and answers to those kind of questions. Better yet, I wish I had a father who came to me and broached the subject even if I couldn't. I just remember being very confused about girls of that age, and much of the information that was passed around between friends ended up being false. As a father, you have wisdom and life experience that are some of the most valuable contributions you can pass on to your child. The mistakes you've made in this area can help keep your son or daughter from making the same mistakes, but not if you don't share them. Yes, your teens probably do think of you as a balding, pot-bellied, over-the-hill old guy, sounds like me, who's living in the past, until they need your counsel to save them from harm. One of your teen's greatest weapons is to try to make you feel ashamed and old-fashioned for sharing your knowledge of anything, but especially of sexual issues. Don't let them get away with it. Share your wisdom boldly and stand by your convictions in this area, especially as your kids become teenagers. They need it. Pornography. Pornography is the most destructive force men and boys face today. It's irresistible primarily due to the male's visual nature. Studies have shown that pornography works in men in the same stimulation center of the brain as cocaine and has the same addictive capabilities. Viewing pornography triggers the release of a hormone that etches erotic images into a man's mind like a developer etches an image on photographic paper. This hormone creates a high and causes the user to want more. These images stay with the man for the rest of his life, desensitizing him towards women and causing him to make unfair and unrealistic comparisons. No real female can compete with the airbrushed images of women who've had professional makeup artists, hairstylists, and photographers aiding them. When I was growing up, about the only way you could get pornography was to steal Playboy magazines from one of my friend's dads. By today's standards, Playboy is tame. Much of the programming currently on network television is more graphic in nature than anything in Playboy in the mid-1960s. Today we are bombarded with a constant barrage of sexually graphic images. Everywhere we turn, sex is being shoved in our faces. Everything from Victoria's Secret advertisements to unsolicited porn website spam in your son's face from the time he wakes up until he sleeps at night. Even department store advertisements in the newspaper and some billboard ads are quite titillating. Sex sells, and Madison Avenue is quick to push the boundaries at every opportunity in order to get our money. If that requires addicting a whole generation of boys to pornography at a young age, so be it. The reality is that pornography degrades women. Pornography makes victims of both the viewer and the viewee. The only ones who profit are those who sell it. It turns women into objects to be played with, property to be bought and sold. It makes the user think women like rape, torture, and humiliation. It allows us to use women for our own sexual gratification without the responsibility or accountability of thinking of them as real humans. Porn also diminishes sexual fulfillment in men. That causes discontent in our sex lives with our wives. No real women can compete with our imagination. It breeds discontent in our lives on many levels. Porn users need bigger prizes, need more degrading, more graphic, and more illicit images. Once pornography gets its hooks in a man, it's an extremely hard addiction to break. It must be nearly irresistible temptation for young men who are in full-blown adolescence. The many times I've cautioned my son and other boys about the dangers of pornography, I've tried to put it in proper perspective. Regardless of what the women involved may say, they are victims of this industry. Many are hooked on drugs intentionally or unintentionally, and must do these acts to feed their habit. Many are young girls who have run away from home and have been coerced or forced through threat of physical harm to perform. When you watch pornography, you are contributing to the oppression of these girls. The women involved in these pictures and videos are someone else's daughter or sister. Someday they might be some child's mother. Would your son like men lusting over and fantasizing about his sister or mother like he does the women in the porn? Guys, the next time you're tempted to look at unsavory material, think about how you'd feel if that was your daughter on camera. Another stat that's come out, I don't know if he gets into this, is that most of those women have been abused previously. And it's their way of acting out that trauma. So you're watching an abused woman continue to be abused. So also by viewing this material, a male is not exercising self-restraint or control. If he can't use self-control in one area of his life, he'll lack it in other areas as well. Boys who learn to govern their sexual urges grow up to be men who are able to engage in healthy sexual relations and are able to control other areas of their lives. Lastly, pornography devalues a man's wedding vows, causing him to live in continual adultery. This applies even if he's not married. Jesus says in Matthew 5:28, "Anyone who looks on a woman to lust for her commits adultery with her in his heart." Author's paraphrase. Pornography is sin. It destroys our relationship with God. The good news is that a man can find cleansing and forgiveness from pornography through God's grace. Pornography affects all of us. A Christianity Today leadership survey in December 2001 showed that 4 out of 10 pastors and 67% of laymen in the church regularly view pornography on the internet. Bear in mind, this is almost 20 years ago. So it's probably even worse now. Your son can access free pornography anytime he wants, day or night. And again, with phones, that's even worse now than it was when this was written, because they didn't have smartphones back then. So guard your computer and television and phones and tablets jealously. Use internet protection software on your computer and program the cable parental controls on your television to block channels boys shouldn't be watching. Don't think my son is too young or innocent to look at porn. You know he would because you struggle so mightily with it yourself. Help protect your son from the scourge of manhood. Err on the side of caution in this area. Ask your wife to help hold you and your son accountable in this area. And for heaven's sake, please talk to your son about the lifelong dangers of pornography. Masturbation. Why is masturbation so difficult to talk about? It's not like every one of us isn't intimately familiar with the subject. Some more familiar than we'd like to admit even. Anyone over the age of 40 remembers being raised with the admonition that you would go blind or grow hair on your palms if you indulged in this act. That puritanical attitude, while generally laughed at today, still lingers in the back of many people's subconscious minds. I had been struggling with talking to my then 10-year-old son about sex in general and masturbation in particular. As Frank and I were returning from his first Boy Scout camping trip, the perfect opportunity presented itself. Frank was required to read the first few pages of the Scout's Handbook with his father. These pages discuss protecting yourself from sexual molestation and abuse. As my son read these pages aloud, it gave rise to questions and opened the door to discussions that made the job of introducing him to his impending sexuality all that much easier. Let's be upfront about this. Frequent masturbation by boys is normal during adolescence. An old joke says studies have shown 98% of boys masturbate and the other 2% lie about it. It might be an old joke, but it's one that's true. In fact, it's normal for even young males to like to rub or touch themselves. After all, a boy's penis is a big part of his life. I would even go so far as to say that it is virtually impossible that an adolescent male will not engage in masturbation at least periodically, despite his moral upbringing or most stringent effort at self-will. Likely, the more pressure that's put on a young man not to indulge in this act, the more he's apt to it. The reason, he thinks about it all that more often. While masturbation is certainly a private activity, excessive disapproval of this natural inclination produces an unhealthy guilt that can affect a man's sexual attitude for a lifetime. Teaching boys the value of self-control in this area without making them feel guilty is imperative. Another sometimes unsettling occurrence in the sexual development of adolescent boys takes place in the form of nocturnal emissions. This is when a young man has a sexually graphic dream that causes him to ejaculate in his sleep. These emissions are normal and are not something he can control. These dreams act as a pressure relief valve for the sexual psyche. Your son will likely be embarrassed, if not horrified, when something like this happens for the first time. In addition, the first emission or two may contain blood, which can be very frightening if a boy is not prepared beforehand. Dad, sit down and talk to your son repeatedly before he gets to the age when these activities become an issue, before adolescence sets in. Prepare him for a life of sexuality with a proper perspective and attitude of self-control. Dating. At what age should boys begin dating? Many books have been written by people much wiser than myself on this subject. However, I believe the age of dating is a subjective, family-specific decision based on the teen's maturity and the level of responsibility he has shown. My son Frank and several of his friends, both male and female, have read Josh Harris's book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. That book caused each of them to make the decision to hold off on dating until at least after high school, perhaps longer. My daughter, Kelsey, upon hearing this, instantly refused to read the book out of fear that she too would be brainwashed. Frank and his friends have decided to break into the dating scene rather cautiously, for which I am grateful. His sister says it's because they're nerds and can't find dates, but I don't think that's the issue. A large group of guys and girls from his youth group at church attend events together, allowing relationships to grow slowly while they learn about the differences between the genders without the pressures of dating. Some pretty clear evidence shows that the longer teenagers hold off before beginning dating, the greater the chance they'll remain sexually pure until marriage. As each of us knows, it's a natural human response to want to achieve a greater level of satisfaction every time we do something. This is especially true during physical experiences such as with drugs or sex. If we kiss a girl on the date, we want to go a little further each and every time, and as each barrier breaks down, going beyond that point the next time becomes morally easier. Discuss with your son the need to make decisions about his personal behavior boundaries before he's faced with a tough choice. Knowing his limitations ahead of time is easier than trying to make decisions in the heat of battle. While you're on the back seat of a car in the throes of passion is not a good time to decide whether or not you're going to remain sexually pure. If your son has made life decisions beforehand, he's not as likely to find himself in a position that requires him to make difficult choices. Dr. James Dobson, in his fantastic book and tape series for adolescents titled Preparing for Adolescence, talks about the importance of making those kinds of decisions beforehand and then cementing them by creating pacts with groups of friends, sort of an accountability staff. For instance, if your son decides to remain sexually pure until marriage, he needs to express his decision to a group of like-minded friends who can all make a pact together. This creates a supportive peer group and a form of accountability. If a friend sees another friend in a situation or relationship that will potentially compromise this pact, he can call him to account. Boys and girls mature at remarkably different rates. Several years ago, I was a consultant with Junior Achievement, so I taught 1 hour a week in an 8th grade class for the entire year. I observed that many of the girls' physical development was that of a typical 12-year-old, while most of the boys were only chest high to the girls and looked about 8 years old. When did girls start developing so early? I looked back at my old high school yearbook at the girls I remembered as being built. I was shocked to see that by today's standards, they look like scrawny little grade schoolers. I also observed these very mature girls figuratively leading these immature little boys around by the nose, playing flirting games that the boys didn't understand in the slightest. In the high school where my wife works, girls may be observed kissing their much smaller counterparts in the halls. They look like women with their pets. Many of the boys wear a panicked look, realizing they're in over their heads. Unfortunately, because of peer pressure and natural male ego, they cannot refuse the girls' advances. I remember feeling downright scared at the age of 15 when I found myself in the backseat of a car with an aggressive girl who was more physically developed and sexually experienced than I was. My escape felt like leaping from the clutches of a lion. While I've jokingly jibed at my teenage daughter that boys are like dogs, they run around in packs, marking their territory and sniffing after females. I think younger boys are much more reluctant to engage in physical relationships than girls. Boys are unsure of how to act in a relationship, and girls scare the heck out of them. Unfortunately, television and the movies seem to equate maturity in boys with sexual experiences. I think, too, a lot of kids now, especially as they're exposed more and more to pornography at a younger age, they see that as the model that they're supposed to follow in relating sexually with women, and that is extremely destructive, which again throws us back to the last section that talked about the necessity to protect our kids from pornography and educate them about how destructive it is. Sorry, now where were we? Obviously, as boys mature, usually later in high school, they catch up with the girls and become the aggressors. It's their nature. Many young men, without proper guidance, will do or say anything to get into a young lady's pants. You need to be as involved in and protective of your son's sexual purity as you would your teenage daughters. Boys need to understand that they have a responsibility in physical relationships. It's not just the girl's job to say no. Sexual purity. Once upon a time, a young man named Jacob went on a journey to find a wife. See Genesis 29. Upon arriving at his uncle's farm, he spied a beautiful, dark-eyed, raven-haired young shepherdess and instantly fell in love with her. The young woman's name was Rachel, and she was the youngest and most radiant daughter of Jacob's uncle. Because of his love for Rachel, Jacob agreed to work for her uncle for 7 years for the privilege of marrying her. The 7 years of servitude flew by, seeming like days because of his great love for her. At the end of the service, Jacob came to collect his payment of Rachel, but his uncle deceived him, substituting her older sister Leah in Rachel's place on the wedding night. The next morning, when Jacob discovered the deception and objected, his uncle told him that their custom was that the younger sister's hand was never given in marriage before the older sister's. Therefore, Jacob agreed to work for his uncle for another 7 years for the privilege of at last marrying Rachel. When he finally got his wish and made her his bride, he was so happy that he volunteered for another 7 years of servitude. This story from the Bible serves as a valuable lesson for young men. Michael Gurian says, "It inspires us to teach loyalty to adolescent males, to teach them to value above all else their responsibilities to those people whom they touch with their lips, their penises, and their hearts. It propels us to teach them to earn love by working for it, even if working for it means working hard for 7 years to develop emotional integrity, good communication skills, good conflict skills. It provokes us to teach them loyalty to the extended family. A male who learns responsibility to extended family in his own bloodline is more likely to form emotional bonds with his spouses." Jacob's delayed gratification in mating with Rachel only made his love for her grow stronger and more solid as the years flew by, As part of the natural maturation process, young men who are forced, or better yet, voluntarily make the choice to wait to satisfy their sexual urges develop a number of positive qualities that don't occur when they are given easy and early sexual gratification. Some of these growth patterns are on a physiological level, and some are on a psychological level. The main point, though, is that young men who are forced to wait develop quality character traits. Part of our role as parents is to protect teenagers from sex until they can acquire the skills of adulthood and take on the responsibilities of marriage and parenthood. One of the things I've noticed over the years is that my son takes his cues on how to relate sexually from me. My son always watches me to see my reaction to a beautiful woman. When he was young, and even now, whenever we drove past a sexy or scantily clad woman, I would feel him looking at me to see if I would follow her with my eyes or take an extended look. Keep yourself and your son occupied, especially with physical activities. This tends to take the edge off the lustful urges and desires that all men, especially adolescent boys, have. Part of their purpose of staying active and stimulating your mind and body is to ward off boredom. When a man is feeling challenged mentally and physically and has significance in his life, he feels secure, fulfilled, and good about himself. This leaves less time and energy for boredom and contemplation of the lack of adventure in his life. This lack of adventure is the downfall of many a male's sexual purity. As John Eldridge says, "It is no coincidence that many men fall into an affair not for love, not even for sex, but by their own admission for adventure. Too often we use sex as a substitute cure for poor self-esteem, for boredom, or for not doing anything significant with our lives. God holds you accountable for your son's sexual purity, like everything else. Because dealing with it is difficult, it's easy to justify putting it aside until it's too late. Remember not to neglect this important aspect of your son's character development." And that is the end of the chapter. So, as always, there's a few questions, so we'll talk about these 3 questions for reflection and discussion. Number 1, discuss with other men the area in which you have the most difficult struggle in maintaining your sexual purity. How would you feel if your son confessed struggling in that area as well? 2, talk to your son beforehand about the changes his body will undergo as he goes through adolescence, as well as those that girls will experience. Then, as he gets a little older, talk about sex, particularly about how a man guards his sexual purity in everyday situations. 3, discuss with your wife what measures you can take as a family to keep pornography from impacting your children. There you go. I know some of the choices that my wife and I had is that we have, we pay for filtering on our kids' devices. And that's something I think if you're not doing that, it's pretty foolish. There's basic stuff built into Microsoft. I don't know about Apple. And then you can also do it on a firewall. If you're a nerd like me, you can do it on a firewall level. But you can just do it using Microsoft as well. You can do some basic filtering. So that's at least a start. The things you can do. You can also limit your kids' screen time if they have to have a phone. Our 13-year-old doesn't have a phone, and he won't be getting one anytime soon. Our eldest child, the only reason he got a phone is because he needed it for a specific medical device. And our daughter got one, but we actually blocked almost all of the apps except a couple that she used for communication. So those are some of the choices that we did. If you have some suggestions or some ways that you're doing it or things you're implementing in your family, let us know in the comments, either on YouTube or head over to betterdadshow.com and you can drop your comments on the post that will include the video as well as the audio there. So you can subscribe at betterdadshow.com. This is a value for value podcast. If you find it valuable, appreciate your time, treasure, or talents. So if you want to share this, if you want to make clips from it, or if you want to donate, head over to betterdadshow.com and you can find out on there how to do that. So again, thank you very much for joining us. Hopefully you feel challenged by reading about this chapter on sex. It's a challenging topic, especially in such a sexualized, frankly, disgusting, in some ways, world that we live in, where even sex is just it's treated as just something you do rather than as something that is so precious and just something that it's a glorious thing in marriage. But it's not always treated that way nowadays, unfortunately. So thank you so much. And we will join you again next week. This week is really good for my family. I'm originally from Canada, living in Australia. My parents are over for 2 weeks. So it's good to see them again. We unfortunately see them maybe once every 2 years when they come here. To travel with a family of 5 to Canada is a challenge. We haven't done that for 7 years now. But my parents have been able to visit, and they're here right now. So that's really good for us. It's really fun to see them. And I absolutely love seeing my kids interact with my parents. It's a lot of fun and a real joy to see. But thank you again for tuning in and joining us. Again, betterdadshow.com. Leave your comments. And as we continue to read this book and continue to strive and work and pray about how we can be better dads, better husbands, and better men. So thank you very much.